Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everyone's doing well. It's been very exciting last few days, particularly doing these webinars for everyone. I welcome those that have joined me, particularly with interest in obtaining their CLPD points. So the subject I'm going to talk about today is about UAE space law and policy, and it's a specific pet subject of mine because for a lot of you who've known me, by way of background, so I started off as a barrister, called to the bar in 2009. I am a member of Gray's Inn. I worked in London for a long time. And then since then, because of personal reasons, I then ventured off into the startup world where I spent about 3 months at NASA Ames. I went to International Space University. I ended up co-founding a satellite propulsion startup, which did not succeed. However, the experience was once in a lifetime, I would say, and I learned a lot from it. So along my journey, I've met many interesting people, engaged with astronauts, and actually, as I was training entrepreneurs, I had the opportunity to also travel the world, as it were. Well, this is a pre-COVID-19 situation, and I was funded by the European Commission, the Ministry of Economy and Trade, to in essence double the space sector. So I spent about 6 months in Tokyo, meeting all kinds of stakeholders from government down to the entrepreneur themselves, and there I produced a magazine of all things, with the view that NewSpace, the concept itself, which I would define in my own view, is something that needs to happen from a very much grassroots level. So why don't I give you that context first and then get into the subject itself. So what is NewSpace? Actually, it's a topic I've been speaking about for the last 2 years, if not more. So the idea of space itself, as many of you know, is outer space, stratosphere, going to the moon. And there are many theories as to why we are not back on the moon, as it were. And one of them that I have is that we've fortunately or unfortunately have left it to the the engineer. Now, I have nothing wrong with engineers. It's just that when we think about it, if you need an ecosystem, let's say the economy of running a business, it's not just the technical side, it's the mentality of how do you run a business. So my thinking is we left it to the engineers, and that's why we've never gone back to the moon. New space is the solution to that problem. New space is about entrepreneurs, businesses, coming together with the mindset of jump-starting the new space economy. So I want to give you some context before I go into talk about the UAE, because obviously there is some historical context, and for all those budding space lawyers and also the entrepreneurs and the well-established aerospace colleagues, you will understand where I'm coming from. So to give you some context, as we all know, the space race was what led us to going to the moon with the then USSR and then America. And of course, astronauts are always as revered, the top, the fittest, the smartest, the highly selective few who will represent humanity to go to space. The thing about new space is it puts it on its head. It's a concept that if you open the economy, the market, of which it is anticipated in, say, 2050, about $350 billion, then you're talking about each and every one of us having the opportunity to access space and go out to space, notwithstanding that you need to be 20/20 vision and absolutely fit and be highly selected. The criteria somewhat changes if you use economics. So how did I get into space? So to give you some background, I, like any other lawyer that started out, had a very traditional education. I was called to the bar, as I said before. I studied my 3-4 years. I went to work in law firms as a paralegal. I started dealing with real life cases because I'm a barrister, so it's court cases, dispute resolution, and it come to a point in my life where I thought there must be more to this in life than just litigation. So off I went, and I went on what I call the hero's journey, and this is also something I wish to develop with my NewSpace 2060, which is the startup that I have running these CLPD courses. And it's this whole idea of what we know and what we don't know. So, for example, right now, a lot of the space exploration, the technologies that we're talking about is what we know, what the engineers tell us works, is viable, and then is advised to the governments and states. However, if you give it to an entrepreneur, they will think very differently as to how you go about solving a particular problem. And what's interesting is when you put it up against market forces, what you're driving at is you're looking at it from the angle of supply and demand. I give you a very good example, air flight. When air flight came about, maybe it was for the lucky few, maybe it was only those that were really wealthy and well off that were able to actually fly. And as more and more people wanted to fly, the price of flying went down, it became more accessible, and now we have cost-efficient flying. I'm really sorry to say, because of COVID-19, that has changed the landscape once again. But if we were to just bear in mind for a moment and draw the analogy with space travel, which is also something I'm very interested in, if more of us are interested in space travel, the price will naturally go down, and therefore the economics of it is become more viable, and we would develop an ecosystem where space tourism becomes a viable business proposition. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I joined as a member of Space Generation Advisory Council, which is a bunch of passionate, and I mean genuinely passionate, people interested in space from all walks of life. And I met a lady who happens to sell tickets on behalf of Virgin Galactic to space. So I asked her, how much does it cost? It costs about 200,000 USD for a flight. Now, if you sit there and you go, okay, wait a moment, she says to me, we already have a wait list, so it's already high in demand. So clearly there are some people on this earth that can afford a 200,000 ticket. But what if we brought the price down? What if there were more people that signed up, and therefore making it viable? In other words, what you're working with is not necessarily the idea of a rarity or premium flights. You're talking about, let's say if it was just 200 people, but let's say you change it to 2,000 people, you bring the price down, and then what if the tickets were then sold for 20,000? Or if better envisaged, later down the line there's more people, 20,000 that wants to travel, you bring it down to 2,000. So you get the idea of the thinking behind NewSpace ecosystem is the more we are involved, the more that we are engaged, we bring the cost down, we make the dream of going to space more viable. And so when we hear about Elon Musk, and I'm afraid he's going to be my go-to person as the godfather of envisioning things happening in terms of interplanetary species and interplanetary travel, then we have to give credit to this idea then ideally. And again, this is all theoretical, by the way, until it's really truly tried and tested. In theory, if we have a new space ecosystem with players, i.e. you and me as potential businesses, as potential customers, then that makes the dream of going to space that much more viable. So I hope that sort of provides the context of why it is so exciting to talk about NewSpace, and it's so exciting as a lawyer, speaking to lawyers and speaking to businesses, what role can you play? So I'll give you a good example of Japan. But maybe before I go to Japan, let's go to Luxembourg. So when I was in the US and I co-founded Satellite Propulsion Startup, the co-founder I worked with actually was the very person that stopped the startup from working or going ahead. And what it occurred to me was that even if a rocket scientist cannot go to space, which he happened to be a rocket scientist, because of whatever kind of reasons, then we are absolutely doomed. Think about it. If a rocket scientist can't do space, then we're doomed. So then I thought, okay, well then we can't do it with the rocket scientist. We have to all go to space. So the sense of urgency has to be there from the get-go. Right? You've got a lot of government policies saying education is important, healthcare is important, the environment is important. Well, why not make space travel a priority? Now, everyone's got their own theory as to why there is a sense of urgency. Elon Musk would say because we need to look at the future of humanity. If it's going to be doomsday one day, I don't know what you think about coronavirus and whether that would equate to doomsday, but then we need to have options. We need to have possibilities, correct? But for me, it's not about that. For me, it's just a natural progression of human development. It's a natural progression of human exploration. So, coming to that, I went to Luxembourg, and the interesting thing was I was traveling, training entrepreneurs at that time, becoming a digital nomad by accident, really. I was traveling the world, I was working off a laptop, and it suited me just fine then because I needed that, and I was exploring the world. But I attended a conference by accident in Luxembourg, and it was the Space Forum. And there and then the interesting story for me was I basically met a lot of space players, and I was inspired by the CEO of Virgin Galactic, who happened to be a great mentor and also a visionary. And when I saw the flights and I saw, what was envisaged, I thought, this is it. As I said to you before, I've done my litigation. I'm still doing litigation and arbitration. But if you ask me what is all inspiring and keeps potentially one awake at night, it's this kind of stuff. So I decided, well, this is something I could do. And then the question was how. So for the luck of me, I applied to Singularity University, and it was a selection process which I applied, I got selected. So I ended up spending 3 months at NASA Ames. And when I was there, what I want to share with you was I attended a conference where it was called Water on the Moon. Now, just bear with me for a moment. To the lawyers out there that I'm speaking to, when you talk about attending an IP law, intellectual property law conference, an arbitration conference, a property law conference, you know exactly what you're looking for, and you know exactly what's being talked about. Trust me, when I attended this conference called Water on the Moon, I had no idea what they were talking about. They were talking numbers, formulas, statistics, and chemistry and biology, which, as far as I'm concerned, I don't know anything about. So I walked in, and pretty much, I don't want to say 10 minutes after sitting down, but literally about 10-15 minutes, I stood up and I left the conference because it was gobbledygook for me. But what I learned, I had to learn it the hard way, but I tried in any event. So as I so happened in America, I tried to co-found this satellite propulsion startup with 2 other co-founders. We pitched to at that time, it wasn't then the Luxembourg Space Agency, but we pitched to Luxembourg. And it was ESA, and we won first prize. It was a good cash prize for satellite propulsion. However, I'll tell you what happened. It didn't happen. I bought a one-way ticket to Luxembourg. It, in essence, fell flat on its belly, and I ended up back doing some litigation in London. And at that time, there was a great mentor based in NASA, a very respectable American teacher and professor and mentor and guide and advisor to the startup. He said, Helen, why don't you go to the International Space University? Now, for the life of me, as far as I'm concerned, we're talking about engineers. I'm like, I know nothing about engineering. Why am I going to go and study there? So my knee-jerk reaction was that. And then, lo and behold, I attended a few other conferences, and when people hear me speak, they hear my passion, and they say, Helen, why don't you go to ISU? I go, okay, fine, I'm going to apply. So I applied for a scholarship, and lo and behold, I got accepted, and I got a scholarship to attend. And this was, we're talking about 1.5 years, almost 2 years now. So I attended the course, and I just am so grateful, because trust you me, when you attend a course, something like that, the best you can do, just sit and absorb like a sponge. Now, a lot of you lawyers understand exactly what I'm talking about. When we have to study through all these courses, these CLPD points, year in, year out, we may or may not know anything about the subject, or we may need to learn about the subject. But when we talk about a subject like engineering, we're talking 2 extremes. We're talking head and toes. So the best way for me to learn was just sit, listen, and absorb. And as I sat there, I want to share with you one of the most inspiring moments for me. And I'm going to tell you this inspiring story before I start talking about the UAE space law and policy. There was a Korean-American lawyer from NASA that spoke. And he spoke about how Elon Musk, Spacex, got their first contract. And he spoke about it like this. Basically, as a legal advisor for NASA, he proposes, providers, contractors for the government, the management, to decide whether this particular contract should go to X, Y, and Z. So you've got the usual A, B, C, and then suddenly there's a new applicant called SpaceX. Nobody's ever heard of SpaceX. So he goes, well, look at their proposal. It's cheaper, faster, why not? So out of all the candidates, he put forward SpaceX. And that was how SpaceX got their first contract. And I'm so happy to say it was a Korean American that proposed Elon Musk, SpaceX, to NASA. And that's the beginning of a very, long story of how now, everyone knows Elon Musk and everyone knows SpaceX. But this idea that it was a lawyer that put forward this contract. Now, why am I saying all this? I'm saying this to give you a perspective. When people say to me, what am I going to do? How am I going to contribute to space? I'm just a lawyer. Well, hear me out, okay? If we're going to have a new space ecosystem, everyone, and I mean everyone, has to play a role in order for this to work, right? If we're going to imagine 50, 60 years ago, and I happen to be, well, actually it's longer, probably a few hundred years ago, if I were the Wright brothers, getting very excited about, sending some, planes up into the sky. If I want this to be a viable commercial option, I need everyone. In the same way that when Steve Jobs or when Bill Gates says, you know what, my vision is for every household to have a Microsoft at home. You get where I'm coming from? We need everyone interested in space flight so that we can all go and fly to the moon, to Mars, etc. Without that momentum, it's going to be a lot harder, right? So this is where I'm coming from. And this passion is fueled by the reality of seeing it happen, right? Now, if you ask me, well, how does this relate to me as a lawyer, as a practitioner? I says, hell, it's a lot. It's a lot. So some people, I will give you an example. When I'm in Japan, and I'm very honored actually to have had that 6 months opportunity in Japan, is you can't think like a lawyer and change the world and make things happen for your clients. What do I mean by that? In space, okay, there are a lot of laws that are not there. In the same way when we talk about emergent technologies, about autonomous vehicles and autonomous shipping, by the way, that's my expertise, my background in autonomous shipping, you cannot talk about giving value to your clients, advising your clients properly if you don't know the subject yourself, correct? So if anyone is going to help a potential business like a space startup, you got to better understand what is going on with space law. And if there's no law in your jurisdiction, well, in this particular context in the UAE, then if you're a smart lawyer, you will try and think of ways, working with the governments, working with stakeholders, working with think tanks to make that law come alive. Trust me, when I was in America and I met with a lot of Silicon Valley space startups, so many of the lawyers there had to lobby governments in order to ensure that their clients got the laws that they needed to make happen. Okay, this is probably going to be another CLPD session, okay? But I just want to give you some context why lawyers are so important to the development of the new space ecosystem. I try to convey this with the few groups that I'm part of, and one of them is the Asia Pacific group. I think they're amazing lawyers, but they're old school, right? And as a new space lawyer, you gotta be forward thinking. I'm going to finalize one more story, and then I'm going to get into the meat of UAE space law and policy. As I was in Japan, I spent 6 months there, and some people couldn't grasp what I was doing. And in fact, let's put it this way, the more intangible what I was trying to do, the more difficulty people struggled with. Firstly, I was tasked to write with a report, and I didn't do that. I did my research, I did the groundwork, and I decided to do basically a NewSpace magazine, which is something I want to continue with, by the way, is that the target audience is not the policymakers. The target audience are the people on the ground, the young kids, the young entrepreneurs who are going to build and develop the next generation ecosystem. In the same way, Snapchat, Instagram is not something I'm afraid to say this, the older generation is going to uptake and change the world with. But the younger generation certainly are. And if you're with me on that, then you understand the logic of how we need to invest in the next generation, which is a very UN thing to say, to make things happen. So for me, I've put my bets on the next generation to bring us to space. And what can we do as seasoned lawyers? Well, we can definitely play ball and be open and flexible to what's coming in. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to go straight into UAE space law and policy. I'm sure you're all very excited and waiting to hear what's happening. So to give you some context, so after Japan, I basically got a job offer to come to the UAE as a project manager, and I was working in reinsurance with one of the largest space reinsurers, and they were doing a fantastic job in reinsuring all kinds of spacecraft and satellites. And then I thought, you know what, the better value I can add is actually back where my practice is, so I reverted back to law practice. But my passion is still with the startups, and it will always be, because it's the ultimate end game of going to space. Okay, so this is the context. So, Federal Law 21 of 2019 is what you want to look at, and I've summarized it in a publication which will come out in due course with a Japanese publication, and so I will certainly share that once it comes out, but I will share with you what I've written, which in essence is a summary. So the UAE Federal Law number 12 of 2019 on the regulation of the space sector has to be read in light with the Space Agency Agenda, that is the UAE Space Agency Agenda 2030. And as we may appreciate, the breadth and depth of that ambition is very much led by the leaders of the UAE. And as you all know, the UAE is renowned for the 7-star hotels, for Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, the biggest shopping malls, and by the way, they're building the next biggest shopping mall. So you can imagine the sense of ambition is limitless in the UAE. So what I wanted to explain is the scale of ambition is overwhelming in the UAE since the launch of the UAE Space Agency in 2014, is that they have the vision of going to Mars. And as all of you know, they've already launched the Hope probe and they're on their way. So, to provide some insights, I'm just going to go through the provisions and for you to observe and probably share with you my insights, and then we can probably summarize and see what we think of the laws and how it would probably pan out in the next, few years. So Article 1 are the general provisions, and by way of summary, as you may imagine, they would define the definitions, including the terms. More recently, terms like space debris, space resources, permits, dual use. And of interest is, the list of definitions is certainly not all-inclusive, and therefore I think it gives a lot of scope for interpretations. Article 2 deals with the objectives of the law, which primarily is obviously allowing the UAE Space Agency to regulate the environment and to achieve the goals of the state's national policy. So there's 3 main things I want to highlight here. A, it's to stimulate investment and encourage private and academic sector participation in the space sector. It's to support the implementation of necessary safety, security, and environmental measures to ensure and hence long-term stability of sustainability of space activities. C, to support the principle of transparency and commitment to implementation of conventions and treaties related to the outer space. So here you see a nice blend of the private and the public sector. Article 3, the scope of the application. So the scope of the application, I would say, is pretty standard, although I think the undercurrent would be tested. So, for example, it's in relation to the state's territory or the state's establishments outside of the state's territory. So I guess it's, for example, if there was a spacecraft registered in the UAE and it flies in international airspace and lands somewhere else, the UAE pretty much would, like the Americans, would want to claim some interest in that. That's how I'm interpreting it. For example, from ship or aircraft registered, or space objects, so it could be satellites, small satellites registered by the state, and by persons who hold the nationality of the state or companies that have headquarters in the state. Now this is interesting because what if it's a subsidiary? Yeah, so I think there's also space for interpretation. Article 4 deals with regulated activities, and here there's a whole lot of it. Now, I want to say that it's an attempt to be all-encompassing, but to be honest with you, I'm also very excited because I can see, last few years there have been a lot of developments with small satellites, the question of, what these new activities could potentially be. So you've got operating launch sites, re-entry, satellite communication activities, removing and disposing of space objects, satellite communication, remote sensing, Earth observation, space awareness activities, space resources exploration, extraction activities, and scientific exploration. Here, I just want to add in a little footnote. Credit to Luxembourg Space Agency. I really want to say they are the pioneers of space mining legislation. Everyone else followed them, whatever you think, but they really have a punch above their weight in terms of what they are doing, and that's why they've managed to attract so many wonderful space startups there. So I want to say congratulations to them. So back to the UAE. So it includes activities like manned spaceflight, long-term human residence in space, construction, uses of celestial bodies, manufacturing, developing, testing technologies, and other space activities, which includes flights, and it also talks about altitudes as well. They talk about distribution, space data, for instance, space data management, and training programs related to space fields, and any other space-related activities. So to be honest with you, I would say the umbrella approach is really the umbrella approach. And I think it's important because, let's face it, the UAE Space Agency is a young institution. So, it's a two-way street, really. They need to know what's going on the ground, and at the same time, businesses need to talk to them so that, there's obviously some sense of consistency, right? I mean, for what I understand, for example, in the UNOSA registration of space objects, if you've got no consistency, i.e. if you're not communicating, then how are you going to know what's happening in the market, correct? So there's just a question of legitimacy, organization, and practicality. So Chapter 2 talks about organizing the agency. So one of the observations I would have about the organization is it's very traditional business or typical UAE government structure. So obviously you've got Abu Dhabi being, the capital, as it were. We all think of, in having spent 2 years in the UAE, we get this impression that, Abu Dhabi is where all the government departments are, and of course where the wealth is, and then Dubai is where all the tourism, all the fun, and all the businesses generally are. So it's kind of split that way, and I think the UAE Space Agency, the way it's panned out in comparison to the MBRSC, the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center is designed is it's very much I guess there's a split in terms of roles and in terms of how they delegate not responsibility but delegate their leadership structure. I guess that's the best way to put it. So the mandate for the agency is to encourage and develop the uses of space science and technology, and to spread awareness of the importance of the space sector. And there are a whole list of reasons and powers that go with this. So, for example, proposing policies, strategies and legislation, granting permits for space activities, support research studies in theoretical and applied fields, finance and facilitate and financing of space activities, work to establish investment projects in the areas of space, international projects, bilateral projects, international forums, supporting and attracting talent, supporting national, international, and may I add, more importantly, and probably in line with UNOSA, also in terms of space environment, sustainability, and then of course media and so forth. Now, the board of directors is, I would say, a list of very renowned directors, mainly from the advanced sciences, and also it's formed by the cabinet decision. So I would say it's, and I've heard this actually from people, that it is actually on one of the, the top priorities in terms of government policies. And Article 9 lists the powers of the board, and I would say they are very extensive. It's no different from any other board, I would say, but I think in terms of the remit, because they are able to propose policies, strategies, drafting law. I mean, they cover the whole works, from the fiscal to the drafting to setting up committees. So I would say the board, like any board, is that. The Director General plays a very interesting role, I think. They're designated with the powers of the agency, but at the same time, I get a sense that they are probably very much guided by the board of directors. So it's not a scenario which you might say is very typical of any organization anyway, but I feel particularly in this particular instance, because of the faceted, or let's say the broad spectrum of power, that the Director General is probably more or less relying on the Board of Directors. In terms of budget, which is also very important under Article 11 and 12, it's funded via the credits allocated by the government, and they come from various sources, including gifts and donations, and the budget year is from January to the 31st, so it's a calendar year. Chapter 3 is about space activities and space debris. So under Article 14, it permits various space activities, and that's also very clear about what's allowed. And it talks about the permits are granted, renewed, and amended by the decision of the Council of Ministers or whoever they choose to delegate. And the exception to this is where the Chair of Directors informs an interim committee. And it's quite interesting because here you will see that there are messages about, in conjunction with local universities or on public policy grounds, and which makes sense to have such an exemption. I can see this coming into play where, for instance, there is very good or sound reason for a project for the UAE Space Agency to take part. In other words, it's something that is so prestigious that, it doesn't make any sense to say no to. Right, so I think there are sort of exceptional delegation powers that come in. Now, the UAE agency is also quite a powerful body in itself, because they basically not only develop the laws, but they also have the power to control the licenses, suspend, and they permit, in terms of, the hierarchy terms of clauses as well. So they will be the body, if let's say a startup wanted to apply for a license, they would be the very body to negotiate with. Article 15 about permission to provide satellite communication services. Now, this is an interesting one because as this is quite a new law, how easy one can apply for this is again to be tested. There obviously, in my humble opinion, there needs to be greater guidance as to how this is done. The reality is probably on a case-by-case basis, so people, if they're interested, they'll probably apply, make an application, have meetings, and then satisfy them in the sense that, we don't know until we sort of engage kind of a scenario. The Article 16 is a manned spaceflight activities, and it's quite, I think, typical, the responsibilities, obviously, in terms of the risks associated in providing, for the individuals, having the necessary training, physical health, fitness, and so forth, and that the onus is on the operator to immediately inform the UAE agency of any incidents. Article 17 is permission for the use of space nuclear energy resources. Article 18, exploration, exploitation of use of space resources. Okay, so back to Article 17. So as all of you probably know, under public international law, states obviously cannot deal with nuclear energy resources. However, at the same time, I think the reason why this is put there because it is in relation to the private sector, which obviously the public international law is silent on. So I think it's actually very wise that they put that in. In terms of exploration, exploitation, use of space resources, I give credit to Luxembourg, because every other state, every other country that's thought of space resources, in essence, the foundation, I would say, came from Luxembourg. Even America, I would say, in that sense. Some may disagree with me. That's obviously my own humble opinion. And then Article 19 is in relation to space debris mitigation. This is a huge, huge hot topic. And I'm actually a member of and recently joined the Space Traffic Management Committee in relation to the International Aeronautical Congress. So and the IAF, the Federation. So it's a very exciting period because I think there's a lot of unknowns, as it were. But there's a lot of, well, I say a lot, there's a few startups that are working on this, and including space agencies, including the European Space Agency and a few other space agencies. So it's going to be very interesting as to, how far this is going to be taken in practice. But according to the law, obviously, this is in relation to the activities, in relation to, collision, loss of control, and all that. Now, I want to talk about liability because I think if we talk about disputes, that is actually my expertise. Under Article 20, liability between contracting parties. So in this scenario, let's say the operator's liabilities are set out clearly, that were any damages to rise on the surface of the Earth or in an aircraft, that the state would not hold such liability, Article 20. Now, I want to say something about liability. In first glance, when you read Article 20 and Article 21, which is on liability towards others, it looks fine. But actually, there's a big question, and the big question is to what extent, if the operator's liability exclude that or cannot hold the state liable, then what kind of liability does the state have? I mean, this is really important because under public international law, the state actually does have responsibility. So there's an interesting, I guess, diversion there where I think it's easy for the UAE Space Agency to say, well, I actually want to remove and distance myself. But then wait a second. If the operator are applying to the UAE Space Agency for a license on the basis that they need this approval to meet the minimum health and safety and whatever requirements. In other words, let's say you're building a factory and you are only going to be permitted to operate this factory on the basis that you have ticked all the boxes. So assuming you've ticked all the boxes and something goes pear-shaped. Okay, something goes pear-shaped. Is it okay for the very public authority that approved everything is well, everything is good? This is a very delicate question to be asked, because I will use shipping as an example because I used to work in the UK Maritime Coast Guard. There's no simple answer, because you work on the basis that the contracting party obviously want the contract to go through. They would have done their analysis on the basis that everything would be fine and that the risk will be minimum. But who's to say nothing catches fire? And this is a great example of a case where a ship caught fire because under the requirements, i.e. from the government side, they needed the vests. And it was the vests, the too many of them, on the boat that caught fire. So the causation that caused the fire was the very reason for the license to get approved for. So you see how it's a very delicate balance, and even when they got the experts in, there is nothing for the state. I mean, it's a catch-22 kind of scenario. You cannot demand the private sector to do X, Y, and Z, and when they do X, Y, and Z and satisfy all the boxes, and it still falls pear-shaped, or some problem still arises, to then kick the tin, as it were, and say, well, it's not our problem now, you guys have to deal with it. I don't think that will go down very well for a lot of businesses, because they would say, hey, wait a moment, I have just spent X amount of time, money to comply with whatever you want me to comply, and now you are, basically taking a backseater and saying, excuse me. So this is something we will have to see how it pans out. And I should mention, actually, I've assisted in some of the drafting, and I think particularly in the reinsurance, there are panels to be created for experts, and I certainly believe that an expert panel would be needed also for dispute resolution. A lawyer talking about a panel dispute resolution, because I think in the same way there's construction law, in the same way there's intellectual property disputes, I think space law is also a niche amongst itself. So I think for people that actually understand what's going on would be a help, because of course you can get general practitioners coming to practice. That is not a problem, and of course they can try and get their head around, but I guess there's a lot of sensitivities and also the nuance of the day-to-day practice that is, I guess, appreciated by the clients. And then Article 21, as I said before, is liability towards others. In other words, if you're a startup, if you're a business, you're an operator, get some insurance. Article 22 is liability for hitting another space object. This is, you got to use some imagination, by the way. The liability of this is pretty much like the other provisions, which is it sets out for compensation of damage. That if it was so vague, and actually this is my own interpretation, the terms are so vague and unclear that would potentially render this clause unenforceable in a commercial court setting. Right? So if a public body is trying to enforce liability towards a private sector in a public setting, I think it's going to be very hard, personally, because there's a whole issue of causation. And to be honest with you, I use the analogy. If you have a road collision, you've got cameras, you've got a black box, you've got something with witnesses to testify what is going on. When you've got stuff hanging around in outer space where there are no eyes, as it were, I mean, you might have some digital imagery, you might have some, I don't know, data, as it were, but you've got to appreciate it's not quite the same thing as a road collision. And then when you get the experts on board saying, this is what happened, that is what happened, which is in the exact same scenario, well, if not exact same scenario, in a similar scenario, like the high seas, right? You don't have live witnesses, but you've got images where you can then interpret what happened. The line that the shipping industry has taken is pretty much mitigate, and you pay your own and I pay my own in terms of fees and in terms of liability. In terms of enforceability, I am very doubtful. Don't get me wrong, I think it just needs a bit of evolution in terms of the law, case law, and how it would actually pan out. But I don't think it's going to be so straightforward that it's a sort of, cut and slice kind of scenario for any party, actually. And it may well be the desire of the UAE Space Agency, because I think, as a governing body, of course you want certainty, and I'm sure businesses want certainty too. But if I may mention, the downside is if the liability is too extreme, which in terms of figures it can be, then what is the incentive of partaking in the space ecosystem? If the cost of joining the club is far excessive to the benefits, at least on the foreseeable benefits, why should anyone join the club? That's a question I would pose. I don't have an answer necessarily, but then it allows for the opportunity of the private sector to go forum shopping. What I mean by forum shopping, to all you lawyers, you understand exactly what I'm talking about. To the businesses, I am saying, if the cost of setting up a business, of buying insurance, of setting up is too expensive in jurisdiction A, then you may consider jurisdiction B. So I give an example of America. Delaware is a very well-known jurisdiction because it's very cost-efficient. It's very easy to set up. And that's why they have a lot of businesses set up there. So that is one of the, I think, economic questions the UAE Space Agency may wish to ask themselves. And obviously it's pending the trends since the launch of this law, how they find it. If I turn to Article 26, it talks about compensation for international claims. Again, my take on that is, sure, you've got the usual investigations, you've got the operators and businesses informing, transparency. But for me, transparency is a big one. I think if you're gonna absolutely put it squarely, getting operators having not strict liability, but in essence pretty much, with the permission, the permits, let's say, okay, let's use example, strict liability, then there has to be a level of transparency in terms of process. And at this point in time, I think that needs to be elaborated by the UAE Space Agency. Chapter 4 talks about other space related activities. Article 29 talks about space support flights. Article 30 talks about meteorites, and it's an interesting one because the UAE essence is laying claim to a special register of meteorites and ownership. And I think this came about, I can't be sure, but I think this came about because there was a recent case not that long ago where I think one of the previous astronauts from America gave some, I think, moon dust or something like this to then a young girl, who then claims that it's hers because it was given to her as a gift by an astronaut from NASA's point of view, it's actually, basically it belongs to the state. So preemptively, this lady, I think, filed for a case actually, and I don't know the exact result, but I think this is going to be very interesting. This is certainly going to be very interesting because as more and more private sector access space, there will be an interest as to ownership. Chapter 5 is on register of space objects. Chapter 6 is related legislation. Chapter 7 is related to managing of risk and crisis and provision of supervision, inspection, investigation. Chapter 8 is on sanctions and penalties, and better or worse, the UAE are big on penalties, and that's something I think all startups or businesses need to look out for. Chapter 9 is on special final provisions, So as a summary, this is what I'm going to say about the UAE space legislation. So firstly, it needs to be read in relation to the Space Agency 2030, and I have to say, you've got to give them all the credit. It is highly inspirational. It is highly, I call a visionary. So it's a visionary, of all the things you can think about, it's a visionary space mission, okay? The difficulty I have is in terms of the practicality, the cost, and potentially the question of transparency in terms of, well, fine, it's all good, you want all this, and tell me the next steps. So I think, given, the limited time and resources, I think this is where, for those that are budding space lawyers or legal counsels or advisors of space startups, this is something we need to flesh out a bit more, engage a bit more to get a better understanding. Now, if for the litigating lawyer, one would say, well, we'll find out soon enough once things go to court. I don't think this is the best approach, to be honest. I think it's far better to draw out some guidelines, if need be. If not guidelines, some good practices, so we can at least know what the next steps are. I really appreciate the vision for the outreach activities in the UAE. They talk a lot about, encouraging children in the space sciences, workshops, and obviously the International Aeronautical Congress was supposed to be in Dubai in 2020 and now deferred to 2021 in October, in line with the expo, which is very, very exciting. I want to say that the UAE has come a long way since the launch of the space agency, and I think credit goes hand in hand with MBRSC, and they've done very well. They've set up, and actually I think there is a lot that could be done as well, like setting up working groups and also dispute resolution bodies to resolve potential disputes. There's a lot that needs to be figured out, as it were. I think there are a lot of accelerator programs. I'm thinking specifically of Hub 71. I think there are bodies which are inspiring. I think there still needs to be a lot more communication, a lot more development to happen. Funding is always at the top of one's mind, and I'm going to be doing my next webinar on this, on funding in the UAE, investments in the UAE, particularly pertaining to startups and opportunities, because it's expensive. Regardless of what people think about space, it is a mission amongst itself, and for the few that have set up, the few that have actually started, I would say that it's going to be interesting to see how it's going to pan out. Insurance, of course, is going to play a vital role, primarily because, when things go wrong, and particularly it has been in the past, you want to have some assurances. You want to know that what you're doing has a backup plan, and that backup plan is having other people, supporting your bottom line. Having said that, I want to say that the opportunity is limitless. I think, having been in the UAE for almost 2 years, I've seen the potential in the entrepreneurs, the startups. I have to say, just sort of as a taster for my next session, and I encourage you to sign if you're interested in investments, is that the UAE market is not like Silicon Valley. In fact, it's far from it. it is not an early stage investor, it is an established investor. If you're going to come to the UAE, you want to have an already viable product, ideally, one that you can sell on the market, and you will do very well. But if you have a piece of paper and a beautiful vision, it is going to be just a little bit tough, only because people like to crunch numbers here. The bottom line is very, very important, like all businesses, let's say. But I would say more so here compared to, say, in Europe, where I've had the good fortune to also work with startups there. They are more practical in that sense. So there's nothing to say you can't work on your idea, build it up, and then come back. But I've had experiences with a number of startups who've come to seek investments, who've been rejected and rejected, albeit that they're not rejected, but they've been held with a potential for a year or so with no result, to then be disappointed. So I think the guiding principle is, if you've got a viable product, you've got a viable service, then by all means you've got a good chance. And there's nothing wrong to say why not test the market. But the way they do business here, and perhaps I'm speaking to the converted, is WASTA. It's not what you know, it's who you know. So I think one of the questions that startups can benefit from is, would you be interested in setting up here in the UAE in the long term? Because that is one of the first questions the investors are going to ask you. It's not good enough, I think, to just say, well, no, I'm not interested, I just want to sell my product here. Because I think you're actually selling yourself short. Sorry, I'm in this sort of coach mode now. But you're going to sell yourself short, because if you don't see yourself here in the long term, then how are they supposed to see you in here in the long term? Does that kind of make sense? So I would adjust my approach in terms of, if you're going to be interested in the UAE market, I would kind of recommend that you also consider setting up here. It will make your life a lot easier. And I've seen businesses and advised businesses that the reason why they lose business, the reason why they're able to gain business, is a difference of credibility and presence. And for better or worse, I've helped businesses that have lost out purely because they had no presence here in the UAE. Now you could say, well, Helen, that counts for a lot of countries as well, how they do business. Well, yes, but I think maybe in the UAE it's particularly so. So, ladies and gentlemen, what do I want to say? What are the takeaways from today's talk? Well, firstly, let me talk about NewSpace 2060. So I'm delighted to share with you that I've recently been accredited, obviously, and that's how I'm able to provide LED CLPD points to those that require it. I am going to create at least monthly CLPD accredited lectures for all these budding lawyers, space lawyers, and the like. I would like to focus more on practice, ethics, and obviously how we can add value to clients. This for me is a must, particularly in a COVID-19 scenario. If you haven't listened to my previous talk, I talked about how we add value to clients by helping them survive and thrive businesses, that is in 2021. There's a lot of concerns, a lot of business trends, a lot of worries about how we're going to do business in 2021. I think there's always a silver lining, and to be honest with you, I think working in the field of space is a real pleasure. It's really inspiring, and it gives hope to the view that sure, we have our realities, but when we look beyond and above, if we look at the world, that the sky is the limit, then I think it gives us great hope as to what we can achieve as well. And it gives us great hope because I believe that COVID-19, for better or worse, has actually brought the future forward. It's allowed us to consider, payments online like fintech. It's allowed us to consider emergent technologies. It's allowed us to actually operate in a way that it would have taken us 30 to 50 years, trust me. I remember working being a committee member of the UK Bar Council, and I spent a stint actually in South Korea, in Seoul, where everything was online. The PowerPoint presentations, the judgments, the courts were paperless. And when I went back to the UK and I started speaking to some of the QCs and senior counsels, they said to me, Helen, us lawyers, we like papers, so I don't think so. I don't think this online thing is going to work. Come COVID-19, you got no choice. Everyone is going online. Arbitration, litigation, you name it. So the power of technology and and how we as humans are so resilient to change. I really wish everyone has taken something from why I'm so passionate about space. And for those budding lawyers who want and are interested, you are more than welcome to join my Telegram, Space Lawyers. And for those businesses that are interested, legal counsels, lawyers as well, you're interested in joining NewSpace 2060, I'm also on Telegram. I want to invite you to join, like and share, and likewise, if you have colleagues who are interested to do the same. For me, it's all about knowledge sharing, it's all about adding value and empowering you to make better decisions. And when I say you, it's you as an individual, you as a business, you as an advisor, to advise your clients to make better decisions. And this is my mission with my startup, NewSpace 2060. And obviously, if it gets us faster to space, all the better. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for like and sharing. And I look forward to sharing with you my next session, which will be on investments. So I wish you all a lovely day and welcome any feedbacks, and wishing you all a lovely day. Thank you. Bye.